Okay, another very important part of when it gets to cameras, we've explained the basic functions of a camera and how to change the amount of exposure, and how changing that exposure can also affect our depth of field and movement in our picture. Okay, when we're doing advanced interiors, we probably won't need any movement, so shutter speed we can kind of set and leave, but we might want some depth of field. Okay, so that's one thing to consider. We also don't have to consider the ISO settings for noise, because that's just not going to matter to us with digital or virtual cameras, I should say. Okay, so we do need to worry about exposure, and we will want to think about depth of field, okay, blurring across a distance. So I'm on Pinterest here, and the other recommendation I want to make to you is to study professional photographers. I'm not a professional photographer. I do dabble, and I am sort of a total novice photographer. But I do understand how a camera works, and I do understand some of the theory behind photography. But it is always best to study some people who really dedicate themselves to photography to see what they're doing, and then try to mimic what they're doing. So if you go on Pinterest and you type in dining room photography, just a basic search. Let's look at some of these things. Here's some mid-century modern chairs, which is nice. It's kind of what we have going on. That's just a really basic photograph. Not really much to see here except for the exposure. You can see that the exposure shows that the outdoors is very brightly lit, and it's kind of a high key image where everything is very bright and maybe slightly overexposed. So it's a white kitchen and it looks very bright in there. So that's one look we can go for. This is kind of the opposite, where it's very, very dark. And what that does is it adds some highlight areas for us to concentrate on. So when you look at this image, your eye will basically ignore everything around here and focus in the center area right in here. And it actually has an awesome effect. I love that image. That looks really good, especially with those deep blues and then these highlights of warm color around it. And so we're kind of looking at the tabletop and the food. So we could do something like that. We have a white kitchen or white dining room. You could make yours dark. The wood paneling could be dark, and you could put some candles in and do some things like that. So these are things to consider. Here's one that shows some interesting depth of field, so that we're not concentrating on whatever's going on in the back here, but we are concentrating on the chairs and the camera and whatever this is here and these lights. Okay, so that's blurred out, making our eyes focus here. Okay, here's an interesting composition. You can do things like this where you're just focusing on a simple part. Again, it's a very high key image, very bright. Nowhere is it overexposed, but it's all very evenly lit with a bright, bright light. And it's mostly focusing on just, if this was our 3D model, we'd be focusing on these very nice 3D models here, and this light and this painting. Okay, that's a photograph, but you get the idea. Now you could go on and see different compositions, different lighting setups. That's a really nice looking photograph there. Again, that's really focusing on this tabletop area with just this really soft glow coming through the curtains. So getting all this in 3D would be awesome. You could use some Marvelous Designer and get these beautiful curtains, the tablecloth, buy some of this 3D models of food and things like that. Really concentrate on the textures to get these nice reflections with some variation going on in them. But we're concentrating in this section is just the compositions. So again, in the same set, this is really nice. You really focus on this chair here because it's red and it stands out from these deep, deep bluish grays in the background. So you need to be thinking about light and how it draws your eye, and also composition and how that draws your eye. And you can see how the different exposure levels will also have the effect of telling your eye where to look and also setting the mood of your image. So if you type in dining room photography vignette, kind of a vignette photo, there's this kind of a popular thing to do in 3D. And I know when I make a really nice 3D model, I like to do I like to showcase it a little bit in a rendering. And some good examples of what that might look like is something like this. Or if you had a really nice model sitting right there, you could do a little vignette shot like this with slight depth of field blurring as you come closer to the camera and slight depth of field blurring as you go away from the camera. And your eye really focuses right in here where it's sharp. So you can use depth of field to also focus the eye. Now the reason I bring all this up is because composition, exposure, lighting, all those things, depth of field even, they will have a big effect on where your eye looks when you look at the image, and that has a huge effect on how effective the image is. If it's too busy and there's too much going on, then it's just not going to be an effective image. You want a focal point that looks appealing and stunning to the eye. Here's a really nice image here. So pretty simple. So you want something that really draws the eye in and looks great. You don't want the eye searching all over and just being overwhelmed with busyness. So that's what we need to think about when setting up cameras. We need to think about composition, lighting, exposure, etc. to make sure we're creating a pleasing image. Images that might be too busy, that are less pleasing than others, I'd say, most of the photos you find on here are going to be pretty nice, but here's one that's kind of busy. See, there's no real focal point there because the lighting is kind of similar. There's all these warm colored books going all over the place, and a warm chair and a warm lamp, and your eyes just kind of looking all over, and that's just not as nice of an image as some of the others that we've seen. Same things going on here, right? So sometimes simplifying it makes it better. The only problem when we're taking pictures, virtual pictures of architecture, is that we're somewhat constrained by what the room is itself, what the design is itself. Fortunately, we're just coming up with a conceptual design on our own so we can tweak it to our heart's content. But we can't necessarily just change the compositions by moving objects around. We have to change the composition by moving the camera around within the space. Okay, so we can only change the composition so much. So our camera placement is going to be very important, and also our lighting is going to be very important to make us focus in the right places and make an overall nice image. So these are things to consider. The overall thing I want you to take from this lecture is to study professional photographers' work and try to mimic what they do. That's the best advice I can give you. Notice some of the things they do over and over again. Notice some of the techniques that they use to really make an image stand out and look good. And we'll try to copy some of that using the cameras in 3ds-Max, which have all the capabilities that these photographers' cameras have as well. We're going to be able to mimic all those virtually. So study those photographers, and let's get into 3ds-Max and see how we can recreate some of the things that they do.